I'm Deb Nelson. I do and teach investigative journalism at the University of Maryland in the USA, home of the Howard Center for Investigative Journalism, and I'm your moderator. We will hear from each of our panelists after a brief introduction, and they'll respond to your questions, comments, and encouragement after all have spoken. So please type all of that into the chat box. It is International Day to End Impunity for Crimes Against Journalists. And GIJC 21, in partnership with UNESCO and with journalists around the globe, is holding up those we've lost to violence, to prison, to intimidation, and shining a bright light on their attackers and on those who let them get away with it. We are committed as investigative journalists to seeking out truth and justice for all. We can't neglect justice for our own. You're going to hear today from 5 people at the front lines of this battle against impunity. Josh Bartman, research coordinator of Safer World for the Truth Project, which today convened a People's Tribunal at The Hague to investigate journalist murders and hold governments accountable. Lauren Richard, founder of Forbidden Stories, a network of investigative journalists, which is continuing the work of threatened, jailed, and killed journalists. Roman Nan, who has shown a light on rampant corruption in Russia and around the globe, and he's going to share the response to Anna Politkovskaya's assassination and the ongoing unprecedented attacks on Russian journalists. Hopewell Chinono, an investigative journalist and documentary filmmaker from Zimbabwe, will share his experience of being attacked for pursuing the truth and what it says about conditions for journalists and their fellow citizens in his country. We'll begin with Kavitha Lankesh, sister of truth-speaking journalist Gauri Lankesh, who was assassinated outside her home in India in 2017. Kavitha is an award-winning documentary maker, and we will open with her short video. We are all Gauri.
Harmony Forum, then we are asking for let there be harmony and peace, that we are arrested and the very fascist forces which are out to destroy the secular fabric of the state have been allowed to carry on their parade and everything else in the city of Chikmagalur today. But this is a fight we have been doing for the last 4 years, and we are determined that come what may, we will not allow the communalization of the state. In 12th century, we had Basavana, who spoke much before Marx about the dignity of labor, about equality, about rationality, and specifically against Brahmin hegemony. But today, all those who claim to be Basavana's followers are BJP followers. It's totally against whatever Basavana stood for. Transformation is such that starting from Kuvempu to URA, Kalaburgi, my father, they're all trenchant critics of Jawaharlal Nehru, of Indira Gandhi, of Rajiv Gandhi. But let me say that none of them ever were physically attacked, let alone death threats. But now death threats has become a common factor in Karnataka.
श्रीमती गौरी लंकेश तुम्हारी गौरी लंकेश निलसले निलसले
ಯಾವ ಕೋಮು ಸೌಹಾರ್ದಕ್ಕಾಗಿ ಆಶಿಸ್ತಾ ಗಾಂಧಿ ತಮ್ಮ ಜೀವನನೇ ಬಲಿ ಕೊಟ್ಟರು, ಯಾವ ಸಮಾನತೆ ಸಿಗದೆ ರೋಹಿತ್ ವೆಮುಲ ದೂಡಲ್ಪಟ್ನೋ, ಅದು ನಮಗೆ ಹತಾಶೆ ಹಾಕೂಡ್ದು. ಭಾರತನ ಒಂದು ಸೌಹಾರ್ದ ಮತ್ತು ಸಮಾನತೆ ದೇಶ ಕಟ್ಟೋದಕ್ಕೆ ನಾವೆಲ್ಲರೂ ಪಣ ತೊಡೋಣ ಅಂತ ಹೇಳ್ತೀನಿ.
ಹೆಪ್ಪುಗಟ್ಟಿದ ನೋವು ಮೀಗಲೊಲ್ಲದು ನೋಡಿ, ಹೆಪ್ಪುಗಟ್ಟಿದ ನೋವು ಮೀಗಲೊಲ್ಲದು ನೋಡಿ.
ಏನಾಯ್ತು ಯಾಕಾಯ್ತು ಹೇಗಾಯ್ತು ಕೇಳದಿರಿ, ಉಸಿರು ನಿಲ್ಲುವ ಮುನ್ನ ಮಾತಾಡಿರಿ ಮಾತಾಡಿರಿ.
Thank you. Every time I see my sister, I'm always get emotional. I'm sorry. Yeah. Anyway, thank you for Global Investigative Journalism Conference for inviting me and for allowing me to show a short film on my sister. It's my pleasure, and it's nice that my sister's voice continues to live on through various platforms, which is important, I think, today, because we live in a very dangerous, insecure, and hate-filled world where no one has been accountable for the killing of 81% of journalists killed in the last 10 years. My country, India, with 20 unsolved murders of journalists, is ranked 12th in the Committee to Protect Journalists, CPJ, Global Impunity Index. Clearly, this world is not safe for those women and men who speak truth to power, because power structures, tyrannical governments, hate-filled mindsets are afraid of them, the questions they ask, the answers they might find. My sister Gauri Lankesh fell to four such hate-driven bullets over 4 years ago on September 5th, 2017. And today, charges are yet to be framed in the trial to have the perpetrators punished. Twice in the past 4 years, I have had to rush to India's top court, Supreme Court, to ensure no derailment in the road to justice, to ensure a just and fair prosecution in my sister's murder trial. She would have ached and protested at the plight of journalism and threat to journalists today, a threat that grows by the hour even as we meet. Just as she and so many brave others would not have backed down from the challenge, we need to rededicate ourselves to a safer world, a more open and honest world. While it has been exhausting and demanding, rarely a day or hours go by before the tears run down my cheeks at my loss, the loss of not just my sister, but my best friend and soulmate. I take succor from the thousands of women, transgender people, and men who've been inspired by a fearlessness and courage. Gauri Lankesh spoke through her writings, exploring and exposing unjust social structures and barriers. Her work transcended barriers created by language, religion, sect, and caste. You know, in India, that is the main issue, which is dealing with caste and religion most of the time. Gauri was not merely a journalist, she was also a peace builder among different communities. She tried to connect the dots and the communities together. I remember there was a time when people like my father, P. Lankesh, who was also a well-known journalist, who spoke against power, exposed various corruptions, irrespective of the political party, brought down governments through his powerful exposés. He was yet safe. He was never threatened, except for some stone pelting and maybe some protests in front of his office. He was always safe. I also remember those were the days when people from all strata of society came together to fight for justice and issues that concerned them. They were farmers, writers, intellectuals, Dalits, minorities, poets, theater personalities, filmmakers, not to forget the common man, all raising a voice against the state about injustice, about equality and inequality, about atrocities. Gradually, they all raised voices only when it concerned their respective fields or their individual concerns. They all became an island unto themselves. But Gauri, I think, was considered influential or even dangerous to some extent because she managed to bring these drifting away islands together. A collective voice is always a threat to the powers. A single voice that can manage to create an echo was what Gauri was. When she was alive and even after. When she was brutally assassinated, her voice continues to ring through the thousands of people. When people continue to say, shout out and sing, we're all Gauris. This is why I say we did not bury her, but sowed her. For thousands of Gauris to be reborn, to bloom, to flower, and to spread love and peace, to live and hope for a just and equal world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kavitha. I will now hear from Lauren Richard.
I was muted. Hello, hi. Hi, everybody, and thank you, GIJC, for having me. Maybe I can tell you briefly about what Forbidden Stories is doing and what we have done so far. But the mission of Forbidden Stories is extremely simple. We are continuing the work of assassinated or under threat or jailed reporters. And we use basically journalism to defend journalism. We want to make sure people get access to the crucial information. And when you have a look to what kind of stories journalists have been killed for, have been jailed for, usually it's about the very same kind of categories of stories about corruption, money laundering, environmental crimes, human rights violation. And yes, so that's how we are doing that. And we are doing that in a very collaborative way. We do work with more than 100 journalists all over the world, with a lot of news organizations who believe in collaborative journalism, and believe in that way of working together and making sure that we can send a strong signal to enemies of the free press that even if you try to kill the messenger, you will not kill the message. So our first project was a Daphne project. Right after the killing of Daphne in Malta, we teamed up with 45 reporters and we continue the work of Daphne, and we investigate as well the killing of Daphne. And more recently, we were able to publish a project called the Cartel Project after the killing of some journalists in Mexico. So we team up again with a lot of journalists to investigate Mexican drug cartels and other organized crime groups who can work with them, whether they are in Eastern of Europe or Africa or other parts of the world. So this is what we have done, and the most recent project was another kind of threats, another kind of attack against journalists. We investigate the Pegasus software. That is Pegasus is the name of a software sold by a company, an Israeli company called NSO, who is selling that software to many governments over the world. And what we did have access to a big leak with a lot of phone numbers inside, phone numbers who are the phone numbers of person of interest for NSO customers. So we start investigating this, and what we discover was the real face of the victims of cyber surveillance. And so we found a lot of journalists, human rights defenders, dissidents, also some diplomats, some head of state, some lawyers. And so that was our last project, investigating that kind of threats. That is really a big threat against democracies, but because when you start using that kind of software that is extremely intrusive, that is extremely advanced and sophisticated, where you can turn on the camera, where you can do whatever you want, you can get the email, the password, you can know who the source is, who the journalist is talking to. So you can kill the story. You can blackmail journalists or families of the journalists. And we have seen in the past what can be done once you're able to hack journalists or people around the journalists. And I can show you by sharing my screen, and I try to do that in a good way, the trailer of the Pegasus project, so you can have a look to that. Okay.
What we have is list of phone numbers that were targeted, and you are among them.
And what does that program do?
It's transmitting your messages, your images, just everything that's happened on your phone.
Shit.
Your phone was compromised.
They send an attack, steal a bunch of data. The moment they do it, the phone is compromised. They can exfiltrate whatever they want. It's just pretty much automatic.
We have access to a lot of information about a massive surveillance campaign all over the world. That's exclusive materials. It's about who is spying on who in many countries.
Journalist Jamal Khashoggi was killed inside their consulate in Istanbul.
His close friends were surveilled after the murder.
Es la constatación de un espionaje planetario, de un gran crimen mundial. Es una bomba atómica.
Yes, so yeah, that was my short introduction, and I'm happy to answer a question to take part to the debate later.
Thank you. So please, just a reminder to post your questions in the chat, and we will come back around to them. So next, Roman.
Hi, everybody. Yeah, my name is Roman Nan, and I used to be the head of the investigative section of Novaya Gazeta, and now I work in a small investigative media outlet called iStories, which does investigations and social reports in Russia. I started my career as a sports reporter in 2006, but I remember the day when I decided that I want to become an investigative reporter, and it was the October the 7th of 2006 when Anna Politkovskaya was killed. I was playing billiards with my father when one of my colleagues called me and said that Anna was killed in the elevator of the house where she rented an apartment. And I realized that sports, I love sports, but probably there are way more important things to cover in Russia than football games. So I joined the investigative section of Novaya Gazeta in 2006, and I was immediately involved. I got immediately involved in the investigation that the newspaper was conducting of the assassination of Anna. Of course, I was young and I wasn't experienced, so I wasn't dealing with investigators and operatives who were doing the official investigation, but it was the investigation in our newspaper was led by an experienced reporter, Sergei Sokolov, who was kind of the supervisor of the investigative section. And I was working closely with him, and I've learned a lot from him. How can you actually work together with operatives and investigators, but simultaneously try to conduct your own investigation? Because you never, in countries like Russia, and I'm sure that it's the same in India and many other places, the interest for journalists, you can't trust the law enforcement all the time. You got to double check them, and you got to do your own job in order to verify their data and maybe get your own sources, which happened in Anna's case. Actually, recently, like a week or two ago, Novaya Gazeta published an amazing documentary on the YouTube, which is called Killing Anna. And the pretext was that a couple of weeks ago, the limitation period on the crime such as the contract killing has finished. And even if the guys who ordered the assassination of Anna Politkovskaya will be found, we can't be sure that they will be prosecuted, because the limitation period is just 15 years. And it's over now. So they published an amazing, Novaya Gazeta, my colleagues published an amazing documentary, and they have subtitles, the movie has subtitles, and I really invite you to watch it, because it tells you a lot, not only about the assassination itself, but also about the environment in which journalists work in Russia, and about Russian media world in general. So my role was modest in the investigation. I was going to a number of meetings, which with Sokolov, who was leading the investigation, because what we were doing, we were trying to find witnesses of the case. And we had to meet with many unpleasant people, with many people from different criminal gangs who were trying to sell us the information about the assassination. And there were a number of interesting cases that were really funny for me, but were dangerous for Sokolov, because on one of the meetings, he says that gangsters tried to kidnap him, and they didn't do that because they saw me on a meeting, and I was this young, stupid, bald guy with a beer and a sandwich. But even the fact that I was there actually stopped them from kidnapping my editor. So, which maybe is a good lesson for all of us, that if we go to dangerous meetings with assassins, it's a good idea to have colleagues, to take colleagues with you, so that sometimes they can save you. And one day we got lucky, because we found a secret witness of the case, and it was just a coincidence, because ex-reporter of Novaya Gazeta was sentenced, and he was in the same prison cell with the guy who worked for the criminal gang that killed Anna. And when the guy got released, he got in touch with us, and he was the crucial witness in the whole case, and his testimony allowed us to, not only us, but also the official investigation, actually to bring charges against the organizers of the assassinations, so the guys in the middle, and the assassins themselves. And it was also very interesting, because the guy was ready to talk only if we help him leave the country. And you can imagine people, especially people living in Europe, how difficult it is to bring somebody from to get a visa for a guy who has a number of who has a criminal past, and who was sentenced for kidnappings and many other crimes. But thanks to the global community of reporters, I got in touch with one of my friends, one of the amazing reporters from Sweden, and he helped with the invitation to this guy, and we brought him to one of the Western countries, and he gave the testimony, and it was crucial in Anna's investigation. But unfortunately, since then, I couldn't imagine that there would be times worse than that for Russian reporters. And probably this year, this period of time is the worst for our profession in the last 20 years. Currently, I'm unfortunately not in Russia, and I'm not even sure when I'll be able to go back, because in April this year, the Federal Security Service, together with the investigative committee, the Federal Security Service is the main secret service in Russia. They conducted a search in my apartment because of the criminal case that they started 5 years ago against me, and I knew nothing about this criminal case. And they started the criminal case because I published a story about the yacht of one of the most powerful persons in people in Russia, Igor Sechin, and I used photos of his wife from Instagram to prove that she spent her time on this yacht. And they started a criminal case. My official status is a witness, but it doesn't. But it changes nothing, because they used the case to follow me for a number of years, to intercept my phone conversations, to hack my email, and even to conduct other operative operations against my parents and people close to me. So I was forced to leave Russia, and I'm currently working from abroad. But I'm not the only one, because the same year, a number of other journalists from Russia were also suffered from searches and raids. Like my colleague Roman Badanin, he was also forced to leave Russia. Like my colleague Roman Dobrokhotov, who was also forced to leave Russia. And not even that, all of us are so-called foreign agents, because Russian authorities adopted a law against the media, which allows them to proclaim any person in Russia a foreign agent. And in order to do that, they have to prove only two things: that the person got money from a foreign country, even if it's a present from a granny living in Ukraine, and if this person spreads information, any kind of information, whether it's blog, Instagram post, or even if you repost somebody. And if you violate the law once, then you are fined. If you violate it the second time, then you might be sentenced to 4 or 5 years of prison, if I'm not mistaken. And we have no doubts that this law was adopted in order to shut down the independent media in Russia and to shut down the critical voices. So yeah, that is all from me, and I'll be happy to answer your questions afterwards.
Thank you. Joss.
Thanks, Deborah. And yeah, I just want to say thanks to especially the rest of the panelists for doing such incredibly brave and inspiring work. So thanks for that. And my name is Jos Bartman from Free Press Unlimited. And I think I will share my screen right now. Let me see. Can you all see my screen? Yeah, great. So my name is Jos Bartman from Free Press Unlimited. And I'm part of the Safer World for the Truth project, which is a project that consists of a merger between the Committee to Protect Journalists, Reporters Without Borders, and Free Press Unlimited. And what I want to do today is say a bit about how we investigate journalist murders from the perspective of myself as the research coordinator of the Safer World for the Truth project. What we aim to do in the project is to investigate journalist murders, document them, but also whenever possible, try to contribute to achieving justice by engaging in litigation. Currently, we have 2 investigations finished, one on the murder of Zubair Mujahid in Pakistan, and one on the murder of Regina Martinez in Mexico. And by the end of 2022, we hope that we have around 10 reports finished. So most of it is still work in progress. And today I will try to keep things quite general, but I will make some references to our investigation into the murder of Zubair Mujahid to keep things a little bit granular. I will not present really this one holy grail method on how to investigate journalist murders, one method that cracks all cases, which probably does not exist, but take you through the investigative steps as we perceive them, which I think are, let's say, minimal conditions of what a good investigation into a murder, journalist murder, should look like. A bit of background on Zubair Mujahid. Zubair Mujahid was a journalist that wrote for the Daily Jang in Pakistan, and he was murdered in 2007, which was a particularly tumultuous time. Pervez Musharraf declared the emergency after being involved in a power struggle with the Chief Justice, Iftikhar Chaudhry. And his declaring of the emergency really emboldened local power holders, local subnational elites to get rid of their political opponents. And that was the context in which Zubair Mujahid was murdered. We did not know when we started the investigation what happened to him, of course, but what we did know is that his murder was followed with complete impunity, which is to many of you, of course, no surprise. Our investigation started as in a way that we usually start our investigations, namely by analyzing a journalist's work. And in the case of Zubair Mujahid, it meant that we needed to go to the archives because most of his work was not to be found online, but we needed to be physically there at the archives of his newspaper. And we used coding schemes to sort of distill the most important topics that he was writing about, and thereby also sort of pinpoint the most important people that he was incriminating in his work. And we found that there were two topics that he was mostly writing about: police torture and police negligence with regards to infamous human rights cases in the region that he was working. And he was mostly incriminating people from the Mirpurgas police department. A second thing that we always do is map out political dynamics. And this is perhaps a little bit less of an intuitive slide, but I think it's nonetheless interesting to talk about. So analyzing a journalist's work is, of course, extremely important, but we also want to know what the vulnerabilities were of the people that a journalist was writing about at the time. So in the case of Zubair Mujahid, we found that the people that he was writing about, which I call collectively the subnational undemocratic regime, basically consisting of district police officers, a chief minister, local landlords, sort of a political coalition, they were really affected by Zubair's writings. So Zubair Mujahid was writing about corruption, police torture, etc., and his writings affected central institutions in the sense that the Chief Justice Chaudhry and some other people that were not based in the Mirpurgas region, but in the capital, intervened in the business of the subnational political elite. So Zubair Mujahid's writings really had an important effect, which was what made Zubair Mujahid as a journalist having such an important effect. We also analyzed threats and intimidations that take place prior to the murder. And in the case of Zubair Mujahid, we found that he was actually detained prior to his murder by the district police officer, Abdullah Shaikh, for unknown reasons. And that he also wrote a letter to his editor-in-chief, Mahmoud Sham, right before he was murdered, in which he called for help and said that Abdullah Shaikh threatened him with dire consequences if he would not stop working the way he did. And on the right, you see this letter that he sent. That is a letter we actually only obtained that the family sent us only 4 months after we started the investigation. So it was a very learningful experience that these kind of things sometimes only come in months and months after starting the investigation. Perhaps the most important thing that we do during our investigation is critically examining the investigation, the official investigation that was conducted. And as many of you know, often there are investigations into journalist murders, but they're not always thorough, effective, and unbiased. So we critically examine basically all the case files that exist. And it has two purposes. One, I think, is of course to find anomalies in the official investigation, which might eventually be of help when we try to reopen the investigation through legal proceedings. But it also gives us a starting point for starting our own investigation and asking the question, what did happen to the journalist of concern? We use a couple of important documents in order to review what went wrong in the official investigation. That's the Minnesota Protocol, which was written by the OHCHR, and the guidelines for investigating journalist murders by the International Association of Prosecutors. In the case of Zubair Mujahid, there was really a whole range of anomalies in the official investigation. Basically, it can be concluded that no unbiased investigation was being conducted. On the right, you see a postmortem report here, which if you read it all, I can guarantee you consists basically of a really unprofessional postmortem report, which does not meet the international requirements for conducting a postmortem report at all. During our investigation, we were of course not able to really pinpoint the perpetrators of the murder directly in court. But what we did find is that different actors had definitely the motives to murder Zubair Mujahid, and we found strong indications of both police involvement and of political involvement, mainly by the political group, the MQM. Of course, I mean, while we were able to investigate that, The report on itself, of course, did not have an effect of really bringing the people that were behind the murder to justice, but it was more part of a strategy in order to make progress with the case. So the way we see it is that the report is part of a public pressure campaign that is aimed at making progress with the case. And currently we're also engaged in litigation. So we went to the High Court of Sindh, where we requested the High Court of Sindh to reopen the official investigation and take the findings of the report into account, and also install a judicial inquiry that has the authority to oversee the investigation in the future. That was my presentation. Thank you. I'll stop sharing my screen now.
There we go. Thank you, Jess. Hopewell.
Thank you very much for having me, and I'd like to thank all the panelists who have spoken before me. It's always difficult to come in after others have spoken, because some of the things they have said, they sort of intersect with what you were going to say. But nonetheless, my name is Paul Shimono. I'm a broadcast journalist and documentary filmmaker. I'm based in Zimbabwe, in the capital city of Harare. The story of our country, the journalism story of our country, is very complicated, because the country became a nation state in 1897. It was a colonial enterprise by Britain, and it became self-governing, I think, around 1923. So the media from there on was state-owned. It was state-owned media, and it was basically used to propagate government propaganda. So in 1960, we became the first country, together with Nigeria, on the sub-Saharan continent to have television. But sadly, up to today, we are now the only country not at war in Africa that has only one television station. This again is because that the government does not allow other voices to be heard. It uses that television station, which is state-owned, for crude propaganda. Then in 1976, South Africa had television. It had television 16 years after us. But now South Africa has over 53 television stations. The one country that we had television with at the same time, Nigeria, now has over 150 television stations. And so it gives you an understanding of how much we've regressed. So in 1980, when we got our independence, Nigeria gave our government $5 million to buy the biggest newspaper group, which was called Argus, owned from Cape Town in South Africa. And it was a gift to the people of Zimbabwe. But the ruling party, ZANU-PF, then took the newspaper group and essentially made it a partisan megaphone for ZANU-PF, which is the ruling party, and the government. We have never had any other political party other than ZANU-PF running the government. And because of that, it was very difficult during those years, in the 1980s or 90s, to have access to any other form of information. In 1998, we went into the Democratic Republic of Congo, what was called the Africa World War, which involved Rwanda and Uganda and Zimbabwe. And one of the private newspapers called The Standard reported about what was happening there. The military and the government were not happy. The two journalists were abducted and they were tortured. And for me, that was the first time that I realized the dangers of journalism in my country, because all along, the state had not been challenged, it had not been cornered in a way that it had to react in a gruesome way that it did. Then in 2000, we had the land reform. And because of this, the violent nature of the land reform, it became very global. Some farmers were killed. Farmers were being driven out of their farms using pangas and being threatened with guns, whereas the state could have simply gone to parliament and legislate. So all foreign journalists were now kicked out of Zimbabwe. And at that time, I was in Britain. I just finished my master's in journalism. So I took that opportunity to go back home because I could work and I could not have been kicked out because I'm a citizen. I was born here, I'm Zimbabwean. But when I got back to Zimbabwe, there was now a regulatory system in place where you had to be registered before you could become a journalist. And when I tried to do that, I was told that I needed to work with one of the approved government outfits, which was essentially a propaganda production house called Mighty Movies. When I refused to do that, they told me that I could not be registered. My lawyer wrote to them, they simply did not respond. That was the kind of impunity that was there, which is still there today. So I had to start working without a license. I had to work underground. And then in 2007, 2008, there was a build up to elections. And I tried again to apply to cover that election. Then I was told point blank that I was considered as a state security risk because of the way I reported and because I report for international media. So they could not allow me to practice journalism or even to cover the election. After that, I covered the election nonetheless without the license. And I made what has now become an iconic documentary film on post-election violence. That was the first election where Robert Mugabe and his party actually acknowledged the defeat, but they chose not to leave. Instead, they embarked on a tyrannical campaign, beating up and killing people. So I documented that and made a documentary film. We then had a unity government between the losers, which is ZANU-PF, and the winners, which is the Movement for Democratic Change, but ZANU-PF was firmly in charge. Then after the unity government in 2013, I'd been working for ITV News as a producer. And in 2015, I left ITV News and started writing for the New York Times. Again, the harassment continued until in 2017, when there was a coup which removed Robert Mugabe. And when Robert Mugabe was removed, the months between the coup itself and the election, which was about 8 months, there was a little bit of quiet. We thought that things were going to change, but immediately the day after the election, we realized that there was no change at all. In fact, the things that we had experienced under Robert Mugabe were now looking like child's play, considering what had happened. 6 citizens were killed for protesting. They were protesting against the late release of election results. And when I started, when I realized that we were fooled, we were told that things were going to change by the new president and his new outfit, we reported, we became targeted. Anyone who reported in a way that they did not like, they would attack. The president's spokesperson operates on Twitter, where he intimidates journalists, he intimidates critics, he intimidates civil society. And in 2019, January, citizens protested against an increase in fuel. They were beaten up. Women were raped. People like comedians were abducted and tortured. Some people were even killed. And we realized then that we were now under a full dictatorship, which was not afraid to use violence to protect its power, violating the constitution, violating human rights. The only difference now between the 80s and 90s is that the dictatorship, like many other dictatorships, had not moved with time, had not adjusted to the fact that whereas in the 80s or 90s, we needed newspapers, we needed broadcasting stations for us to communicate or to practice journalism. In the 21st century, you don't need that. All you need is your phone and a Twitter account or Facebook or Instagram. And those are the tools that we've now been using and using effectively. And so in 2020, COVID happened, and there was a huge scandal which sucked in people, very powerful people, some even in the president's office, who were essentially looting public funds, stealing public funds meant to deal with the issue of COVID, to buy PPEs, to buy masks. And I started reporting on that. I think it was in May. As I said, I was just using my social media accounts to report what was happening. But I wasn't just reporting, I was putting out the evidence, the documentation of what was happening. So the ruling party was upset by that. It pulled out its spokesperson to have a press conference where I was specifically singled out and attacked. And I was told that because I was writing about this corruption scandal and involving the president's family, I had become an enemy of the state, and that I should stop immediately what I was doing. As a journalist, knowing that there is nothing illegal that I had done and that everything I was doing was underpinned by the constitution of the country, I continued with my work. But on the 20th of July, I had 7 gunmen with AK-47s. Part of them were from the police, part were from the intelligence services. They broke into my house. They hit a glass door with an AK-47 and walked into my home, dragged me out, and I was taken to a police station. After 2 days, I was taken to court. I was denied bail 3 times, and I spent 45 days in prison. And I was accused officially of incitement to public violence because they said I had incited citizens to protest when essentially what I had done was to report that there was a protest which was being earmarked by a local activist and politician. So they said that it was incitement, but we all knew, the whole country knew that I was being punished for my reporting, for exposing that scandal of looting public funds meant for COVID-19, which involved very powerful people. And in November, on the 3rd, I was again arrested. That was in 2020, last year. And this time I was arrested for exposing corruption. Again, it involved someone from the higher echelons. It was a niece of the president who had been caught at the international airport trying to smuggle 6 kilograms of gold to Dubai. I got wind of information that she had struck a corrupt deal where she was going to give unopposed bail. And when I reported that, it was me instead of the people that were involved in that who was arrested. Again, I was thrown into prison for 21 days. I eventually got bail from the High Court. On the 8th of January this year, 2021, again, I got people from intelligence and police, they came to my house, picked me up, and took me to the police station. Again, I was arrested, and they charged me with a law that did not exist. I went to the magistrate's court. Surprise, surprise, the magistrate said there was overwhelming evidence and he refused to give me bail. Again, I had to get bail at the High Court. So it has become a tradition that we will never get bail from the lower courts, from the magistrate's court. You have to go to the High Court, but this is meant to make sure that we are punished. You spend at least 20 days in maximum prison, the worst prison in Africa, Chikurubi, and then you are released after that. So it's like pre-trial punishment. So that case was eventually thrown out by the High Court because the law did not exist. I continue to be harassed. One of the journalists that worked on the same story that I did, called Mdudu Matutu, had his nephew abducted and tortured. He had to leave the country and is now living in Britain. So these are the sort of hurdles that we're facing in this part of the world. Interestingly, our neighbors like South Africa, in Zambia, the culture is different. Specifically in South Africa, they are allowed to practice proper journalism without being intimidated, without any hindrance. But in this country, journalism is treated as a crime. The state is now crafting, I listened to what Roman was saying, in Zimbabwe, the state is now crafting a law which stops you from communicating with diplomats or communicating with anybody working for any government. It's called the Patriot Law. It means that if I communicate with a diplomat, I can go to prison. And they're thinking of crafting another law which says if you are perceived, not just seen, but perceived to have called for sanctions against the present government internationally, again, you will not be allowed to hold public office. Again, you will be persecuted. So these are pieces of legislation that are meant to stop journalists from doing their work, and targeting well-known journalists like me. It's very deliberate because it sends a chilling message to young journalists. And a lot of them have told me that they are afraid of covering some of the stories because of what they've seen happening to senior journalists like me. I'm by no means, my case is the worst. There's a journalist called Itai Zamara. He was abducted about 6 years ago and he was never seen again. So some journalists have actually died because of their activism, because of how they are opposed to the abuse of state institutions by the ZANU-PF government, the looting of public funds. The looting has become so frenzied that our biggest hospital only has 2 maternity theaters, only one is working. They were built by the colonial government in 1977. All it takes is to spend as much as they spent on a Land Cruiser to build another theater, and yet $15 billion went missing from our diamonds. Every month, Zimbabwe is losing $100 million worth of gold every month. That's 1.2 billion. And that's a very conservative figure. It might be more. Yet our hospitals require only, all the central hospitals require only $50 million a year to run. And when we report these things, we are called foreign agents. We are called puppets of the West. We are called Western puppets. They say we are collaborating with foreign governments to try and bring down the current government. So thank you very much for having me, and thank you very much for allowing me to tell the Zimbabwean story and to speak on behalf of journalists in Zimbabwe.
Thank you so much, Hopewell. We now will be pulling some questions from the audience for all of you. The first question is really directed at each of you, so it'd be interesting to hear what each of you has to say. Do you feel that journalists, media outlets tend to forget investigating attacks against themselves? Without your organizations, without your individual efforts, do you feel that attacks on journalism would be highlighted by media outlets or ignored? And how can we change that? So who would like to field that first?
So my first hunch would be, definitely not always. It's not that journalists worldwide ignore attacks on other journalists. But I do think that so much is still to be done. And there are these journalist cases that become really famous and that are investigated by different multiple investigative journalists, even NGOs, et cetera, but there are cases like the one that I just talked about a little bit that were completely forgotten. We actually thought when we started the investigation that because there was so little coverage, that the journalist would actually be quite an unknown journalist, just writing just writing on an irregular basis, etc., etc. But while doing the investigation, actually, we figured out it was quite a well-known journalist. It was just the fact that no one reported about it. So a lot is being done. I think one of the problems is, of course, that to do an investigation into a journalist, it takes a lot of patience and time. And I'm not sure, I'm not a journalist myself. I can imagine that it's also a difficult issue. We're an NGO, so we have more, in a way, resources to wait a little bit longer, perhaps. And perhaps there are also ways, for example, I mean, what Laurent Richard is doing is also, I think, an option. But yeah, overall, I think my conclusion is definitely there's way more to do than is currently being done. Absolutely.
I think maybe to add something on what just say that the problem that we are facing is that I think definitely journalists feel much more than before under threat and under attack and facing different kind of attack by the technology, the cyber attack, the legal attack, but also some attacks from the public opinion. We are suffering a lot of distrust from the public opinion with the journalists, with the media industry. And that's and this when you see how journalists can be threatened because they were just investigating fake news network, or how in the Philippines or in India you can face harassment online just because you try to do your job as a reporter, and so it's the thing is since we are all over the world suffering a lot of there is a kind of lack of visibility of what journalism is or who journalists are, for who we are working for. We are just working for the public interest, for the public opinion, for the general interest. We are not paid by anybody except the people we are delivering the stories for. But there is a lot of confusion. People think that we are part of the elite, part of the power. We are not anymore a power against another power. So I think it's the more we have confusion about the role of journalists in democracies, the more we are facing threats and from on Twitter, on social networks, yeah, the more dangerous it is to be a journalist. And the second thing is what is killing the more the journalists is not only the threats, not actually the killing, but the impunity behind after the killing. And if you are not solving the killing in India, in Malta, in Mexico, then you are sending a strong signal to the others. You can do that. You can get over with that. So that's the problem is to make sure that our governors will understand how it's important to defeat impunity. But that's so difficult. I guess in the country of Roman, in the country of Kavita, it's way more difficult than it is in France, of course.
What is the role of international organizations in this effort? What can they do, and what are they doing? What can they do, and why aren't they doing it, or are they?
I mean, yeah, of course. I mean, I'm working for basically an international organization, and well, basically, one thing is that we can investigate journalist murders. We can really focus on cold murder cases. I think that in some occasions, I mean, Laura is absolutely right. In some occasions, it's really hard to tackle impunity, but there are also opportunities in some cases, and international organizations may have also the capacity to engage in litigation and also in advocacy, and in some instances, even in some sort of diplomacy. So I would say international organizations can fight on all parts of the front line, basically. Yeah.
I think that the role of international organizations has helped people like myself and others in my situation, because without those organizations, it would be difficult for the rest of the world to know what's happening. You see, what happens news cycles is that you are coming from a country that is not of great interest to the media. Sometimes the story is not even known about. But if you are coming from a country which is of great interest, it's easier for the media to write about these stories and to highlight the issues. So when you're in a situation where you're coming from a country where people are not focusing on what's happening there, international organizations then matter. International organizations and civil society that focus on journalism, they push for international media organizations to actually deal with this kind of stories. And I hope that organizations like UNESCO could come up with a standard that every country is asked to sign up, because each and every year we have all these nice words coming out from world leaders about the protection of journalists, and yet they don't actually underpin those words with actions. They go and do the opposite. Journalists are tortured, journalists are killed, and we have the cases like Khashoggi, who was murdered in Turkey, and yet powerful countries like United States of America don't put a proper price on their allies like Saudi Arabia for doing such things. So they keep repeating them because some other countries will see that Saudi Arabia has gotten away with it, so they can also do it. Now, Khashoggi was very high profile, writing for the Washington Post, one of the biggest newspapers in the world. Now, if it's somebody in Zimbabwe writing for a local newspaper is not known, they will just be killed and nobody will do anything about it. Like my colleague that I mentioned, Itai Dzamara, who was abducted and obviously killed. And 6 years later, nobody's doing anything about it. The government of Zimbabwe continues to punish journalists, continues to jail journalists, and because there hasn't been a proper prize, punitive prize, for them to realize that if we do this, there's a huge price to be paid.
That brings up a question that one of our members of the audience raised, which is how do you impose to Joss and Laurent, but really to everybody, how do you choose which cases to investigate and highlight with so many to choose from?
So our intention was to have some diversity with regards to geography, right? We didn't want to have only a case in Latin America, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, it was a bit complex, but well, unfortunately, there are countries where we do not have any investigations because it's basically too dangerous. So we look at hybrid regimes, basically. So regimes with a mix of authoritarian and some democratic institutions. So places where actually there are many journalists murdered, which is really bad news, but places where there are sometimes opportunities to hold people accountable. In such regimes, there are still sometimes some people, some institutions to talk to, and therefore some windows of opportunities. So that those are the regions. So that's the region, sort of the universe of cases from which we make selections. But unfortunately, of course, we can't select all journalists. So that's the bad news. Yeah.
Yes, I can explain. So on Forbidden Stories side, we, as just say, that there are so many killings, so many journalists being jailed, so that we, with our small non-profit, we cannot, unfortunately, continue the work of each of us. So what we try to do is to focus on one case a year and to do all the kind of investigation all along the year, but to try to think about one investigation where we can add some value, where we can really bring new information to the public opinion, where we can also convince a lot of partners to be on board, because we want also, by synchronizing the publication, having impact, and say that this journalist have been killed 1, 2, or 5 years ago because he or she was investigating that, and you should feel concerned about that, because when a journalist is killed in Mexico, most of the time we heard that every day again, and even yesterday. So those numbers we heard every morning on the radio show when we woke up, like a new Mexican journalist being killed. It sounds like more a statistic that we became a bit used. And what we try to do is to explain that this journalist being killed in Mexico is not only a Mexican story or a Mexican crime. It's a crime against press freedom, but it's also a crime against the information and the access of all of us to the information, because the drug cartel who was behind the killing, or the politicians behind the killing, are connecting to a lot of the drug cartel businesses all over the world. So that's why what is happening in Mexico is also very concerning for American people. Even if you are living in South Africa or everywhere, you should feel concerned about that. So we try to bring more people on board. We try to focus on one specific investigation where we can add some value for the public interest and get a lot of talents on board to make sure we can deliver a very important stories for the public opinion.
Thanks. A sadly practical question. Do attacks on journalists by the state follow any sort of pattern? As in, are there warning signs that journalists should be on the lookout for when doing explosive investigations?
Yes, there are some patterns. One of the pattern is first the level of impunity. If you don't have justice, if the killers think that it should be fine for them after they executed the killing, and they can get away easily with that, then they will feel free to do so. If there is some corruption, it will, of course, facilitating the killing, of course. So you see all of that when you have corruption, impunity, when it's a country that is resisting to international pressure as well. And so it's a global mechanism that we can see, and of course it could be different case by cases and countries by countries, but maybe Kavita or Paul can add on that.
Yeah, in fact, my sister had got a few warnings, and a lot of trolls, of course, on social media and everything. A lot of hate messages and hate speeches against her, even when she was alive. And in fact, she had told us that, I'm on the hit list. We thought it was a joke. And in fact, we didn't take her seriously because we come, as I said, from a family of P. Lankesh who had brought down governments, who had, done so much more exposure than Gauri has ever. But Gauri apparently, became more, she was more vulnerable, I think, that way. When at the time of her death, she had about 80 cases on her file against her. And people, in fact, the chief minister at that point had asked her if she wants a gunman for protection. But she said, which journalist can ever move around with a gunman behind her? As state security behind a journalist is not really a journalism kind of work. So she had refused that. And on hindsight, we think, did she need protection that way at all? In fact, a very economical CCTV, which she had put in front of her house, was also, a coercion by her colleagues, saying, please put a CCTV, at least if something happens. So her version was, it we know who will stand it after I'm dead. So what's the point? So of course, whatever protection she did take or did not take, I don't know, when you're speaking to a power and, exposing any regime, if it's a fascist regime, how much protection can you take anywhere? People have been, in fact, as you know, it was not Gauris' death was associated through the investigation, the Dabolkar, the rationalist, Pansare, and as well Kalburgi, intellectual, all these four people's murder was connected with Gauris' case because the murderers were the same, the syndicate was the same. So, how can you, in fact, there was 42 people's list on the list to be killed in the future after Gauri. So somehow through, the investigation which happened, Gauri's kind of happened not too bad, quite meticulously, I would say. The the murders have kind of stopped or at least paused for the moment. So that's one good thing I must say, but still the kingpins are missing. So of course, as Mr. Payal said, a lot of UNESCO and now Forbidden Stories, I think you have come to us to help us out in saying what can we do to bring pressure. I wish it had been done a little more earlier in that sense, because I mean it's still worth it. It's still not, the case is not, the trial has not started yet. But I do hope there's a lot of international pressure, not just to my sister's case, but as I said, most journalists who who are speaking to power. Yeah.
Hopewell, I wondered if you might also address that. What are the footsteps that you listen for? And do you have to make a calculation at some point when you're pursuing a story? Do you stop and say, do I want to spend 30 days in jail for this story?
I think in my case, I'll start with the things that we usually see, the signals. It's usually through social media. They will inbox you, they will send messages. In our case, mostly state security agents. Some that sympathize with what you're doing will tell you what's going on, what's being planned. Some who are trying to intimidate you will also send messages threatening that you'll be killed, will throw you into prison, to do all that. But as a journalist, you get to a point where you say to yourself, I'm just doing my work. You're not doing anything that is illegal. And unlike my colleagues that are operating, like, for instance, in countries like Latin America, where there are drug issues, they're covering drug cartels. In Zimbabwe, it's mainly about corruption, the looting of public funds, the plunder of the nation's natural resources. So you have to make a decision whether what you're doing is worth doing in terms of informing the public. And in my case, I always use the standard that what I'm about to expose, what I'm about to write about, how does it serve our society? So for instance, when I did the COVID-19 looting of public funds, I realized that a lot of my compatriots were dying every day because of this pandemic, and yet state officials were looting these funds. So I was prepared to go to jail for that, because my going to jail in itself actually helped to highlight the looting that was taking place, the corruption that was taking place. And it sort of gives you some kind of immunity. It gives other journalists some kind of immunity, because at least it's now out there. Whereas if you are investigating and they find out that you're investigating and you don't get to write about it, it takes away that security that you usually get when you publish.
So we are out of time, but I wondered if you could just share some last thoughts about what we can do, what we in the audience can do to help.
I think what needs to be done is for society at large to understand that journalism is a greater force for good for our society. Without journalism, ruling political elites would do more damage to our societies. They would be corrupt, stealing public funds, they will be stealing natural resources, they will be allowing cartels, whether it's drugs, to operate. And what citizens need to understand is that it has an impact, not only where it's happening. There are certain things that are related, the relatedness of things. If Zimbabweans are subject to a corrupt regime, and if journalism is not working in that country, Zimbabwean citizens will leave, as we have seen. We have got over 2 million people. I've always told ruling elites in South Africa that if you don't assist journalism in Zimbabwe, corruption will continue rising and our citizens will continue living and putting pressure on your own social resources and welfare systems. Zimbabweans are found in America. Zimbabweans are found in Britain. Some of them are not necessarily professionals, but Because of good journalism, we've been able to flash out some, for instance, the reporting that I did, the health minister was fired, and this sort of gives hope for the future, for citizens and for journalism, that if we continue on that path where journalism is seen to be working, people will think twice before they do these terrible things, be it abuse of human rights, be it abuse of state institutions. And it's important for citizens across the world to understand that if they hear about a journalist who has been incarcerated in country X, they should pay attention and put pressure on their government, because once that person is incarcerated and nothing is done about it, it sends the wrong signal. It sends a signal that it can be done and you can get away with it. And who knows, one day it will end up on your doorstep.
Thank you. Any other quick words of what can we do? What can we as journalists do to help?
Yeah, I think that's we just have to first to think about how to be aware of the kind of risk journalists are facing, and so the information about threats is extremely important, and I think it's very important that we should not be used to that kind of level of threats, and we should be always very reactive when we heard some threats, and I really think that one way to give or to add more protection to our work is to work with collaboration, with partners, is to not be alone. And I think that this is something we are doing at Forbidden Stories, but we hope others will do the same or will replicate that kind of collaboration, whether it's a collaboration with the 2-3 partners or 60 partners or 100 of news organizations. It doesn't make sense to kill a reporter or to threaten a reporter if you know that there is 10 or 12 or 15 or 100 ready to take over. So I think this is very important as well. Then what we can do is to, regarding the safety of our communication, because I really think that it's really one of the most modern and the most dangerous threats we can face, because now for many governments, it takes them 5 seconds to know who your source is. And so it will take 10 more seconds to kill the story, because they can blackmail your sources without even you knowing that. So one thing that could protect us is having, even if it's difficult to protect ourselves for that kind of attack, and we are not spy, we are not military people, we use regular devices, but we need to be very careful and maybe to separate what is personal and professional, and to understand that when you are texting someone, this message might fall into the hands of people who are surveilling you or surveilling the source you're talking to. So we have to keep that in mind. And then I think the last thing is to, as I was saying just a few minutes before, that is to consider like what is happening in Zimbabwe or in Mexico is not only isolated cases. We did a project called the Green Blood Project. We were investigating the sand mafia in India or the gold mine in Tanzania. But the gold was then sold to the Silicon Valley. The sand was sold to New York and Paris and everywhere. So, and journalists are dying or get arrested for that kind of stories. So what is happening against a journalist somewhere is never something that should be isolated, and we should all feel concerned about that. So it's also about how newsroom, and as Oprah was saying, that sometimes there is a lack of interest. Oh, how can we do a story about Zimbabwe or about this country in Europe? We don't know too much about that, so we will not do a story about that threats against that journalist. This needs to change, definitely. And so this is much more to the editors, but also to generation of new journalists, that we need to be much more open to what is happening all over the world, because we are all connected.
Just wanted to add that I think it's important to always realize that when a journalist is murdered or attacked, it's not just actually taking away the rights to life, but is also an attack on the access to information. So I think it's it's important to see an attack on a journalist in that way as an aggravated crime that is also an attack on democracy. And in that light, I think it's important to also demand from our political leadership to make safety for journalists really a top priority. And I think that currently, at least not in the country where I work from, it is enough of a priority. And I think, of course, sometimes it may seem as if accountability is absolutely absent when it comes to a journalist murder. But I think sometimes there are possibilities to hold political elites accountable for these murders. Recently, in the case of Mexico, the Miroslava Breach case, someone from within the subnational political elite of Chihuahua, a former mayor named Schultz, Hugo Ahmed Schultz, was actually arrested. And it really showed that with political pressure, with investigation, it is possible sometimes to really hold people accountable. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. We're about to be cut off here. Thank you. With that sound, with that word of hope, thank you very much. Thank you, all of you, for you're an inspiration. And there are a lot of questions that we didn't get to. So I hope you'll look those over and you'll have a chance to connect with folks over the next week. Thank you, audience.
Everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.